Let's record with this computer. All right. And it is recording. So, hello and welcome again, everybody. Hopefully, y'all voted on Tuesday, because that's why we didn't have class. Let me put on. There we go. And then turn on presenter view. So, where last we left off, I believe we were talking about political turmoil within the Texas Republic. So, just as a refresher, even though Texas was fighting wars with Mexico pretty much until 1842, they had some internal strife as well. For instance, there was the Regulator-Moderator War, um, where dueling vigilante groups argued over land claims and who could enforce the law, and ended up killing about a little over 50 people. And then there was the Texas Archive War, where basically the president of Texas, Sam Houston, wanted to move the capital to what is now Houston today, and as part of that would have had to move the archives, but some lady showed up with a cannon and fired it off and told everyone to stop trying to move the archive, and scary lady with a cannon stopped the archives from being moved, though Houston actually employed spies to try to keep it going for a while. So you had all of that craziness going on, because, well, just as we saw with the beginning of the U.S., inevitably there will be political turmoil at the beginning of any new political entity. The one lucky thing is they didn't degenerate into civil war like so many revolutions do. For instance, Mexico had degenerated into civil war. But Mexico had maintained a claim to Texas the entire time. They never recognized it as a separate entity, despite the treaty that had been forced on Santa Anna to claim that it was a free and separate entity. Mexico never recognized it and continued to lay claim to the entirety of Texas, but especially considering on the last slide, there we go, there had been a number of invasions, both from the Texans and from Mexicans, often fighting specifically over this little stretch of land. Turn on the pointer. This little stretch of land right here between the Nueces, which actually goes pretty far up around here. This is a print from 1845 by an American newspaper, so you can guess what that is. Hold on a second. There we go. So they continued to lay claim to all of this area, and so did Texas. So that was a point of contention that remained unresolved. And they also, of course, claimed all the way to the Sabine River over here, which was kind of silly considering, the United States had pretty much instantly recognized the Republic of Texas. Before the revolution even happened, there'd actually been a number of attempts by, you remember back with Jefferson that he had laid claim all the way to the Rio Grande, but that didn't go anywhere and ended up the Treaty of 1819 put the Sabine River as the line. So a number of presidents after him tried to buy Texas, with John Quincy Adams and Jackson actually sending diplomats with specific requests to buy Texas. None of these went through, but you could already see that there was a drive to annex Texas even before the revolution. And once the Texan Revolution had happened and they had declared independence in 1836, not about a year later in 1837, on the last day of Andrew Jackson's presidency, so right as he was about to get out, he pulled a trick and recognized Texas as an independent entity. By doing so, that essentially gave Texas a international claim to sovereignty. And so, after all of this fighting and everything, and much of the fighting to come, they had international recognition as an independent entity. But as the as this as the republic kept going, they had difficulty maintaining sovereignty because of Mexico trying to invade. Mexico failed, of course, but they also failed to invade New Mexico when they tried to take Santa Fe, and even the United States stopped them from sending another expedition to Santa Fe. But the Democrats especially wanted to annex Texas. They were, remember, they're, the party of democracy, what the people want. And of course, Americans generally wanted to expand. It didn't matter where, they just wanted more land. And so in the election of 1844, what's called a dark horse candidate, as in somebody who managed to cinch the nomination of their party, and is basically a total upset. A good example of this would be Donald Trump in 2016, who was a total upset of the was pretty much laughed off of being considered a candidate, and then lo and behold, after the primaries, he became the candidate. Same thing with Polk. And so Polk was kind of like an unknown as a result of that. And so Polk, especially during the campaign of 1844, wanted expansion. He had four main points, all of which he would actually uphold as president. But his four main points was that he wanted to annex Texas, he wanted to buy California, and he wanted to fix the joint treaty in Oregon. Remember that Oregon is currently being held jointly by Britain and America, and fix the banking system. Basically require banks to be part of a federal system of reserves, and basically preempt the system that we have today. But the main one, the thing that was the most contentious of the election, and why the election was actually kind of considered a referendum on that the current president, Tyler was it says Taylor, but it's supposed to be Tyler. It's the negotiations were happening at that moment for the annexation of Texas. Throughout 1844, the Texas had finally turned from trying to be an independent entity under President Lamar there, and with Houston um, back in power, he wanted to have Texas annexed to the United States. And so in April of 1844, a treaty was actually negotiated, but rejected by Congress. So it wasn't until February of 1845 that a treaty um, was accepted by Congress, and this is back when the president is remains president all the way until March. We do it in January, but that wouldn't from the beginning of the Republic all the way until until the 20th century, the president would remain president even if they were not elected, like Tyler wasn't. Tyler, remember, he had been, Tippecanoe and Tyler too under William Henry Harrison, but Harrison died in just a month. So Tyler was called his great accidency. Um, but as a final act, remember, they have multiple months as as what's called a lame duck, as in somebody who can just um, um, uh, is not elected but is still president. As a lame duck, he formally signed the treaty to make Texas annexed, although it wouldn't be until December when they formally entered the Union. And when they entered the Union, those border disputes with Mexico went unresolved. So that leads us to today's lecture, which is, hopefully it actually switched. There we go. So, today's lecture is on the Mexican-American War, which started specifically over those border disputes. And this war set the U.S. on a particular trajectory that would ultimately bring on the Civil War. But as a result, the U.S. would take the Southwest, as in where we are now in New Mexico, all the way until 1848. This area was considered either part of Mexico or part of the Spanish Empire. But the Texas claims to New Mexico would actually set the stage for an ongoing struggle after this, called the sectional crisis. So this is kind of a seminal moment where suddenly the issues inherent in American politics are brought out. So as a refresher, remember we were just talking about Texas's claims to this area. Notice that their claim goes all the way up into what is Wyoming today, but nobody lived there, so it wasn't a concern. But you'll also notice there's Santa Fe on the Texas side. Now, of course, all of these maps that were printed in 1845, took the Texas side because, well, they're being printed by Americans, and it's in Americans' best interest to maintain the larger claim. But Texas actually had a pretty strong claim to the Nueces Strip. Remember, they'd actually been fighting over it. Um, there were Texan settlements right here, but there were also Mexican settlements right here. So this entire area was heavily contested. Um, this is the Nueces River, so that's why it's called the Nueces Strip. Um, notice that this map actually marks it as contentious. You can't read that here, but this map actually says like an area of great dispute. So that tension would lead to the to war. But at first, the Polk presidency did try to at least negotiate with Mexico. But remember, he had campaigned in 1844 to specifically annex Texas. Um, you know, he would fix the banking system and buy Alta California. Alta California is what we call is what Mexico called California, what we call California today. There's Alta California and Baja California, basically tall and short California. The higher one being the California we have today. And he campaigned that he would buy that, not take it by force. But with as the annexation of Texas took hold throughout the first year of his presidency, the Americans really wanted that disputed area. You can see in this map that what is the disputed area. But notice that that includes what is New Mexico today, and Texas never really got much of a claim stated there. They failed in their expedition over there. There were settlements in the Nueces Strip, though. But with all of that, Americans wanted the further land, and this guy named James O'Sullivan, who had was a newspaperman, had been campaigning vociferously. He had supported some of the filibusters and whatnot, and so he really wanted it. So he made a new term called manifest destiny. And the basic idea is that the United States has a destiny to manifest itself from sea to shining sea. It was this idea of that the U.S. had a predestination to go all the way to California. And so a lot of Americans were working under the assumption that they just had this destiny to take more land. And by June of 1846, the Oregon part of Polk's entire platform was resolved by a treaty between the U.S. and Britain, putting the line where it is today for where Washington State is. So he had managed to actually peacefully resolve that, but it didn't go so peacefully to the south. Remember, Mexico still claimed the entirety of Texas, and so by the U.S. annexing Texas, this was a huge upset. Plus, on top of that, there were the continuing claims to the Nueces Strip. there had been conflict there from 1836 all the way to 1843. Um, in fact, um, in April of 1845, remember, Texas wouldn't be fully annexed until December of 1845. But in April of 1845, Santa Anna sent 5,000 troops north of the Rio Grande. So um, Santa Anna was occupying the Nueces Strip, this disputed land, before the annexation had gone through. So um, we'll see that what's weird about the Mexican American War is, in some ways, Mexico could be considered the aggressor, but remember all of these long-standing conflicts. Texas was, you know, taken in a very strange way, um, and so in July, in to answer um, Santa Anna's aggression, um, Polk sent in Zachary Taylor, um, who would end up being the who would actually end up becoming president after this, but he would be the leader of the Mexican American War, and Polk sent Taylor with 3,500 troops to occupy the Nueces Strip. Um, and mind you, the Mexicans were already patrolling it, so this is like a recipe for disaster, right? Um, there's competing claims. There's now armies in the disputed area, and they're set up specifically to fight each other's aggression. What doesn't help all of this is that Comanches had basically depopulated the area. Comanches held a huge amount of territory. If we go here, Comanches basically held this entire area right here. They held a huge amount of land. And even worse is that they would periodically raid. Remember, we talked a lot about Comanche raiding in the previous lecture. And a lot of that meant that they would be rebuffed off of Texan settlements around San Antonio, particularly with the Council House fight, and would end up either heading south, where, as one Mexican official said, there were vast deserts made by all of these Comanche raids, or they would try to follow the Rio Grande and raid everything along there. So Mexican settlements, especially, were simply non-existent. There was a tiny amount of settlement here and a tiny amount of settlement right here, but Texan settlements right here and right here were far more extensive. So in terms of actual population, Texans had a greater claim. But the fact is that Comanches made it so that this entire area was incredibly weak militarily. As I said, there were the one Mexican official, actually their Secretary of War, said that the northern provinces were made vast deserts. And he didn't mean deserts as in like the ecological feature. He meant as in there were no people there. So the Comanches were a pretty decisive factor in terms of setting up this war, because they had made the Nueces Strip easier to claim by the U.S. But the U.S. was still going to try to take all of this area peacefully. So Mexico had actually been in severe debt for a while. there were um they were in such bad debt. And remember, a lot of countries got got their um their taxes by tariffs. Same with Mexico. And in 1838, they had been so bad in terms of repaying national debts that the French formed a coalition, including the United States, to intervene and take their customs house. Um, and so in 1838, the U.S. had actually participated in a war against Mexico. Um, but it was really just a blockade to pay for their debts. But you can see there's already that money is a huge concern for Mexico. And so in November of 1845, just before the Texan annexation actually went through, they Polk sent John Slidell to Mexico to offer $25 million for Texas and a $3 million for the for debt forgiveness because of all the debts that they had incurred to American businessmen, and 25 to $50 million for California. So this was a huge amount of money. The problem was Slidell was rude, to put it mildly, and he was kicked out of Mexico rather quickly. So you had basically the only attempt to resolve these issues peacefully was ended. And so Mexico continued their strong patrols in the Nueces Strip, and a company of 2,000 Mexicans managed to run into 80 U.S. soldiers and proceeded to kill 11 of them in a small fight. The leader of the 80 U.S. soldiers was a guy named Lieutenant Thornton, and that's why it's called the Thornton Affair. This happened in the Nueces Strip, and essentially Mexico had drawn first blood. And Polk, seizing on this opportunity, on the 11th of May, addressed Congress saying, "The cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte," as in Rio Grande. "But now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States." Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war. Sure enough, 2 days later, Congress passed a declaration of war on Mexico. But remember, this was on disputed land, so when he's saying it's on American soil, that's arguable. And it's not like the U.S. didn't have patrols either. But remember, Santa Anna had been the first aggressor in that regard. So you have, now there's an excuse, right? Now the U.S. can use all of her might to take all of this land. But there was actually significant opposition to the war in the United States. The Whigs especially opposed this annexing of Texas, because they were afraid that it would upset the fragile Missouri Compromise. Remember, in 1820, there had been a compromise that specifically stated that slavery would not pass this line right here. You can see the get this out of the way. You can see this is the bottom line of Missouri, and notice that Texas right here is aligned with that. So that's still according to the Missouri Compromise, that slavery would not be in any northern state. But they were afraid that this much new slave territory would upset the balance, and they were pretty correct, actually. Um, the this would be the ongoing conflict for the rest of this class. Um, so they weren't exactly worried about the expansion of slavery itself. They were worried about breaking up their compromise, because Whigs had led the Missouri what would become Whigs, um, would um, would cause that. So Henry Clay, um, also known as the Great Compromiser, would become a Whig once that party had formed. Um, so there was that, but there was also many in the Northeast who were very much concerned about the expansion of slavery. So former President John Quincy Adams said the war was a way for the South to have, quote, bigger pens to cram with slaves, unquote. Um, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, you might remember from the Transcendentalist faction of the Great Awakening, um, uh, ended up making a big show of not paying his property taxes, and and a poll tax, and so he was thrown in jail for that. But he was doing it specifically to oppose the war. And when his friend Ralph, it's Henry David Thoreau who was thrown in jail. It's Ralph Waldo Emerson who came to bail him out. And when Emerson showed up, he yelled into the jail, "What are you doing in there?" And Thoreau retorted, "What are you doing out there?" The implication being that only a only a good that if the law is unjust, then the just man deserves should take the brunt of disobeying that law, and as a show. And this is actually the beginning of what Thoreau would eventually write a book called Civil Disobedience, based on his experience during the war. And that book, Civil Disobedience, became the foundation of nonviolent resistance throughout the civil rights movement. So this is the beginning of that idea, that idea of nonviolent opposition, called civil disobedience. And then on the Congress floor, even once the war was taking off, in 1847, a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln started demanding that Polk show the exact spot where the Thornton affair happened. Remember, it was in disputed territory, so it was in the Whigs' interest, and Lincoln was a Whig at this point because the Republican Party did not exist. But the he demanded that there was that they show the exact spot where the Thornton Affair happened, and that the disputed territory did not count as American soil. Both of these things were arguable, and he kind of made a fool of himself, constantly saying that, quote, that this was, quote, a bold fabrication of history, unquote. As we could see, it's actually part of a much larger thing. But Lincoln was a young politician and learning the ropes at this point. He would end up losing his seat over all of this um, because, you know, most of his constituency actually wanted war. He was just being a partisan. Um, and ultimately, Americans wanted this war. Um, so here's a map. Just keep it in mind of what the war um, eventually came out to be. You can see there's a lot of moving parts. Um, you've got Kearney coming all the way over here, and eventually going down here into California. California has its own war that's basically a completely separate war. And then you also have the movement south to eventually capture Santa Ana and end the war, along with a blockade that steadily worked its way south, eventually defeating the Mexican Navy in very few engagements, but the Mexican Navy was pretty weak. And of course, you have Doniphan's expedition here. So you have all this movement, most of it centering on trying to get to the to Santa Ana. But let's first talk about California because it's basically a separate war. So California had been part of all of those revolutions in the 1830s against Santa Ana. And this came in the form of a guy named Juan Bautista Alvarado, who took power in California in 1837. He overthrew the Mexican appointed governor. Now, they did try to impose a new governor in the visage of Carlos Antonio Carrillo, but Carrillo tried to rule from Los Angeles, where the actual capital of California at this point was Monterey. And so he was easily defeated in the Battle of Santa Barbara, when literally they just charged the town over and over and over again until somebody from the town went and joined Alvarado, and that was it. That was the battle. That decided that California would remain an autonomous province. And Alvarado actually threw up a flag as to show his independence and that was just a white flag with a red star. So if you look at the California flag today and you see that red star, that is referring to the Alvarado star. So the by 1841 they started making tentative proposals to have California annexed. But Alvarado himself was pretty suspicious of foreigners. In fact, in 1840, he made an executive order to arrest all of what were called extranjeros. Extranjeros. Extranjeros means just foreigner, as in foreign people who had not naturalized as citizens. And throughout all to California, hundreds of people were arrested and started being transported. But eventually, this was actually because he thought that there was a conspiracy to overthrow him by extranjeros. But like this was a complete fabrication, and he ended up actually ordering them compensated for the time that they had been arrested. So you've got a kind of dynamic that like Cal, um, Alvarado is looking at annexing California to a foreign country, or um, trying to maintain its Mexicanness. And it went back and forth. For instance, in 1842, Mexico sent General Mitchell Torrena, who took over California from 1842 to 1844. But he tried to make it into a military colony, um, and eventually the Californios um, threw him out. But the U.S. was kind of the biggest one in trying to propose this annexation. The local counselor there, named Thomas O. Larkin, um, Larkin was constantly trying to um, ingratiate himself with the local Californios and trying to basically sow disruption with them and the Mexican government down south. Um, but the U.S. also had the Pacific Squadron, which had standing orders from 1840 onwards that if it appeared that war had been declared between the U.S. and Mexico, you can see these tensions are pretty long-standing, that they had this order in 1840, that the Pacific Squadron was to take California. And in 1842, this actually happened. The Commodore of the Pacific Squadron, named Thomas Ap Catesby, Ap Catesby Jones, is too many names, led this Pacific Squadron into Monterey and raised the American flag, officially conquering California. By accident, actually. He didn't know. He had received word that there was a war brewing in California. That war was not war between the U.S. and Mexico. That war was between California and Mexico. That was General Mitchell Torrena when he was going north. And in fact, Mitchell Torrena's invasion of California was disrupted because of this. He actually had to abandon a bunch of arms that are still missing to this day somewhere in San Luis Obispo County, California. And, well, possibly in Santa Barbara. We don't know. They're somewhere in the foothills. And there's just a bunch of guns that are sitting somewhere buried in the hills because of this. Because the U.S. accidentally conquered California for a day. Once the issue had been cleared up, and obviously there was no war between the U.S. and California, the U.S. and Mexico, he lowered the flag and left. But the you can see that there's a lot of tensions already. And mind you, there is a huge gap of information between California and the rest of the East, because basically this entire territory right here is just desert. There's nothing. There's nothing there, save for you have some Apaches and Navajos around here, some Yavapai, just basically a bunch of tribes, but they're not communicating or sending communications. This is not a way that they can send communications. So anything coming from right here, where the capital is, Monterey, has to go all the way down to Matamoros or Mazatlan and then across, which is precisely what a young lieutenant in the Marines, in the U.S. Marines, did. He followed that path to catch up with this guy right here, or this guy, who knows? It's some bearded guy named John C. Fremont. Fremont um had been been on an expedition to map out the interior West. This is actually the second time he had been to California, um, and so and so he was already pretty familiar with the land there, but ended up getting turned away because he was basically not welcome in California. And so he started heading north into what is now Oregon, right around Great Bend. I mean, not Bend. Yeah, Bend, I think is the name of it. But near Klamath Lake. Um, and that's when John Gillespie managed to catch up with him. There is a lot of confusion over what Gillespie told Fremont. Gillespie had actually met with Larkin before, supposedly giving him the same letter that he would be giving to Fremont. But some historians have argued that Fremont was given some sort of extra secret orders beyond what Larkin was. And basically, Larkin was told, hey, there's trouble brewing in Texas over this whole annexation thing. Be prepared and try to make sure that California, if something happens, is like, going to be nice to us. But some historians have argued that Fremont was told something quite different, for he turned around and headed back south to Sutter's Fort in where is now what is now Sacramento. Sutter had been kind of a place for people who had been traveling what's called the California Trail. So, like, American immigrants coming into California, many of them being illegal immigrants. But remember, Alvarado had thrown all of the foreigners in jail in 1840. So there's a lot of animosity. And then they get word that there is supposedly a squadron of Mexican dragoons coming for them. And John C. Fremont just randomly shows up, and there's a lot of argument as to what that entailed. Now I'll leave that open to you, but personally, I think a lot of these arguments are spurious and do not actually contend with any kind of evidence. But the but you can make that argument. And so they revolted. They took over the what turned out to just be a few dragoons who were transporting a large batch of horses, and then took over a barracks in Northern California. This was big because they eventually declared independence. They declared the creation of the Republic of California. Notice this has nothing to do with what was going on in the East yet. It just happened to be simultaneous. And so they declared independence in on the 14th of June, 1846. Now, Fremont had arrived in February, so you can see there's a bit of overlap there, but he actually remained hands off for a little bit while everybody was sitting there in Sonoma. Sonoma being the place up in Northern California where they took over. It's called the Sonoma Barracks. It wasn't until July that Fremont joined with the Bear Flaggers. They, as a part of declaring independence, of course, you've got to make a flag, and so they made a bear flag. And so they were called Bear Flaggers, hence why it's called the Bear Flag Revolt. But it didn't really remain independent for very long. For literally 2 days after Fremont joined the expedition with the Bear Flaggers who were moving to take Monterey, Commodore Sloat joined with the U.S. Navy. And this was kind of the deciding factor. And from then on, it was basically just the California battalions sweeping south, or naval raids on ports. For instance, what was then called Buena Vista was officially renamed to San Francisco by Sloat because of the conquest. So the actual name San Francisco comes from an American conquest. They managed to take over a good chunk of California, but there were a lot of, like, they would take a town, move south, and then the town would rebel against the garrison they left. So eventually, from far off in the actual, like, Mexican-American War, Kearny arrived in December. They had only found out that that there was even a Mexican-American War happening in November, only a month prior. So all of this had happened as a completely separate war from the Mexican-American War. And then Kearny arrived to unify it and promptly gets defeated in San Diego at the Battle of what's called the Battle of San Pascual. But despite being defeated pretty handily, he turned around and ended up joining forces with Fremont and managing to surround the Californios. And so Kearny basically forced the arrival of Kearny basically forced the beginning of treaty talks, which were signed on the 13th of January, 1847, at Coaga Pass. But it was signed by John C. Fremont and gave too generous of terms to the Californians, many of whom actually went south to fight on in the Mexican-American War. All that being said, this did not make Fremont a happy character in Kearny's view, and they ended up butting heads over how to run California, and Kearny arrested Fremont and sent him back east to be held at Fort Leavenworth for a court-martial. And eventually was actually found guilty, and so he would resign his commission as a U.S. Army officer because of this. What helped was the arrival of a batch of reinforcements in early 1847. First, the Stevenson Regiment from New York, and then a batch of Mormons called the Mormon Battalion, who arrived in San Diego only a few weeks later. And this sets the stage for how California would be run later, but we will get to that in the next lecture. But you can see it's kind of a separate war from trying to take Mexico. The initial campaigns into Texas were pretty handily defeated the Mexicans, but then there was a larger question as to where to go. So the first move was to take New Mexico. The Kearny, same Kearny who would arrive in San Diego later, ended up creating the Army of the West to basically follow the Santa Fe Trail into New Mexico. And took it without any trouble. Actually, there was no fighting. Um, they ended up the main fighting initially was actually against Navajos to try to protect New Mexico. Um, and then so Kearny just kept going after instituting what's called the Kearny Code, the first U.S. law in New Mexico. Um, but in December of 1846, there was a rumored insurrection that was put down and stopped, and the main people who led it were executed. Um, and then in January of 1847, around the same time that the California War is wrapping up, a large revolt took place in New Mexico here, um, right around Taos, and the American governor Charles Bent um, was assassinated along with many other U.S. officials, and there was a huge uprising. But the U.S. Army quickly put it down um, with a large force showing up, and basically most New Mexicans kind of stayed off. But in Taos, there was a huge siege of a church there that ended up with more than 100 Puebloans being burnt alive at the church. Um, they refused to leave once the fire began. Um, so while the New Mexico campaign was technically peaceful, you can see the Taos revolt wasn't. Um, and so you have all of that going on. And then there is the attempt to try to catch Santa Anna. So two prongs started heading south to try to capture him, and then the Navy landed a bunch of Marines south at why they have it in their hymn, the Halls of Montezuma, um, to try to go from the south northward. Um, And so with these great prongs, you had to make sure that Santa Anna wouldn't escape. And so they blockaded the coasts to stop any kind of um, escapes. Now, the uh, the uh, the initially they were pretty successful in terms of battles. The Mexicans were ill prepared for this war, and also fairly under-equipped. They were still using cannons that would have been considered old in the War of 1812, let alone 30 years later. And so the U.S. in basically every single battle was winning over and over and over again. But Santa Anna kept on escaping. And it wasn't until the Marines actually landed in Veracruz. By the way, one misconception about that is that it was led by Marines. I mean, you can even see in the picture here that it seems to be led by Marines. It was actually led by the U.S. Army. But with that, when you have basically a vice grip on him, the the fighting ended in October of 1847. So, despite that, you'll notice that the war technically continued all the way into February because the U.S. occupied Mexico City, but the hinterlands around there continued to have guerrilla fighting for quite a while, at least until the treaty negotiations ended in February of 1848. With all of that, remember there was still some significant opposition to the war, and some people who had actually joined the army, especially people of Irish descent, found a lot of hatred of them because remember this is also when there's a huge famine happening in Ireland, and so there was a lot of Irish immigrants, and a lot of Northerners really hated them. The nativists constantly um, actually massacred them in a bunch of riots and that. So the Native Americans, as they were called, were pretty significant within the army, and so they made a lot of Irish people, um, Irish Americans, dislike the expedition, and so there was a whole bunch of Irish Americans who joined, who switched sides, who literally turned coat, and they formed what's called the St. Patrick Battalion, which was originally a U.S. Army battalion, but switched sides to the Mexicans, and so that's kind of a big deal. And so once they were captured, um, in September of 1847, the largest mass execution in U.S. history was of what the Mexicans called the San Patricios, St. Patrick, San Patricios. So the San Patricios were 50 of them were hanged en masse. So with all of that happening, this is the climate that the negotiations were happening over the treaty that would eventually come to be called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is a district in Mexico City. But a lot of Americans wanted. Whoops, that's the wrong one. A lot of Americans wanted much more than just what would become the Mexican Cession. You can see here, this is the what would be bought by the treaty. But many Americans, including John O'Sullivan, the guy who had coined the whole Manifest Destiny thing, wanted all of Mexico. They basically wanted to, they had conquered, we had conquered Mexico fair and square. They had been the initial aggressors, so on and so forth, right? But also there was strong opposition within Congress on racial grounds, that they would constantly refer to Mexicans as a mongrel race, and that trying to incorporate all those so-called mongrels would be too difficult for the purity of the United States. Remember, white supremacy is still a very clear concern for all Americans at this point. Well, except for the Americans who are, in bondage, but they don't get a say, do they? So with all of that, you can see there's kind of a push to not even annex anything more, especially by the Whigs, who, were opposed to the war to begin with. And there's this real fear that taking even more territory will cause further problems with slavery. And so this is the national climate that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was negotiated in. But even weirder is that Polk sent a negotiator who had who he recalled during the negotiations because of just political necessity. But the guy ignored the orders, basically did the oh, sorry, transmission's been garbled, don't know what you said, and negotiated the treaty anyways. And so this made ratifying the treaty pretty difficult, as you can suspect. And what the treaty entailed is that Mexico recognized Texas at the borders that they claimed. So that included the Nueces Strip, which basically started this entire fight to begin with. The U.S. also annexed Alta California and Nuevo Mexico. So, or New Mexico. So the weird thing about what we think of as New Mexico today, this area, um, was actually just this little area right here. Otherwise, the rest of it was considered Alta California. All this hinterland was technically California, but there was nobody there. Well, there was suddenly a new batch of people right around here called the Mormons, but they were kind of happy to have their own state. But the hold on a second. My mouse is freaking out. There we go. So they bought what's called the Mex concession, what you can see mapped out here, for $15 million. Um, so kind of basically fulfilling what they had offered in the first place, just got it a bit cheaper at the cost of quite a few lives. The U.S. also paid $5 million to fulfill Mexican debts and declared that they would stop Comanche and Apache raids south of the border. But the U.S. Army never was able to succeed in this, so that was one of the first things to fail in terms of this treaty. Once it was actually signed and ratified, and also the treaty guaranteed that property rights would be acknowledged, and that would be a kind of difficult issue that actually continues to this day, that there's a number of land grants even here in New Mexico that are heavily disputed over basically legal issues about who actually has it and whether or not it applies under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So you have all of that, and Apaches almost immediately started raiding across the Gila River. The Gila River being what was then the southern part of the United States after this treaty. So you can see the Gila River is right here. See, that was the southern part. But then there was also a lot of dispute as to what the heck this border was, because part of the problem was that the treaty that the map that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was based upon was faulty. It didn't have a very good place for El Paso here. Now, El Paso is actually what we now call Ciudad Juarez, but it was supposed to extend from Ciudad Juarez, and so this entire southern area was difficult to uphold. We actually had a joint border commission that tried to map it out, and they came up with 3 separate lines, each more progressively further south, some of which including land that we don't even hold today. And then, of course, there were a number of people who didn't like who thought that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo didn't go far enough and wanted to take more land, and so they started trying to filibuster. Most notably, a guy named William Walker, who would actually end up taking all of Baja California and then tried to take some of Sonora before getting beaten and sent back running across the border. All of this, the Apache raids, the border commission, the filibusters, meant that clearly there was something that needed to be done, and that ended with the Gadsden Purchase, or as some of you who have lived in New Mexico long enough will know, a place called La Mesilla, or Mesilla just for short. Mexico knows the treaty as the Treaty of La Mesilla because there was actually a lot of the disputes centered around that, where Las Cruces is today. Las Cruces didn't exist yet. But the first draft of which came out in 1853. So throughout all of this, there is 5 years of just difficulty trying to deal with the different permutations of it. And so they the treaty was fully ratified in June of 1854, spending $10 million to get all the extra land to the south here that we see right here that is now part of the United States. That was negotiated as part of this treaty in 1854. And that paid for $10 million. It also stipulated that the U.S. had no obligation to stop Apache raiding. The Comanches at this point had lost pretty much all power to raid like they had. So you have all of this going on, and what we will talk about next week really changed the game during all of this, because remember we were talking about Sutter's Fort, where the Bear Flag Revolt happened. This Sonoma's up here, and Sutter's Fort's right around here. Well, Sutter's Fort had a mill, and the person who was working the mill there would find gold in 1848. And that is where we will begin next week. So that would start the gold rush. So first of all, any questions? Let me stop screen share. There we go. And open up the chat. All right. So first of all, are there any questions on this huge and complex situation? Well, we have just enough time to ask one crucial question. Who started this war? So Nikita says Americans. How so? Well, yes, you can. You could definitely see with Manifest Destiny that Dante says they wanted land, and certainly, but Nikita says they wanted land and kept moving till they got it. And in many ways, yes, but you also have to remember when we're talking about who starts a war, oftentimes it matters on who shot first, right? And the answer there is Mexico. So you have this weird dynamic where, yeah, and Nikita just said that, but it was instigated, as Nikita says, yes. So you can argue that, you can argue this either way, that, Texas was, a sovereign entity and they were infringing on Texas's borders. Or you can argue that Texas, the revolution in Texas itself was kind of American aggression. Some people argue that some historians argue that the Texas Revolution actually constitutes a filibuster. And then you also have the oddity of California, and like a lot of that hinges on whether or not Fremont was acting on his own, or not. So you can see there's a lot of debate here to be had, but no clear answer. There is no you can't really say that this was American aggression. You can't really say that it was Mexican aggression. It is an argument either way. And so think about what this will cause in the future, because pretty much the rest of this class will be dedicated towards the journey towards the Civil War. And this is integral to that. And remember, the Whigs were afraid that this would upset the balance, and it very much did. So with all that being said, any further questions? All right. Well, if you guys don't have any questions, I will see you all on Tuesday. It will be the same link as before. I might email you again to um, remind you, but otherwise, have a great weekend.